The Ottoman Empire lasted for over 600 years, reaching its peak under the rule of a man so rich and powerful, he proclaimed himself Sultan of the world. To this day, the 15th century palace of the Ottoman sultans sits high upon a hill in Istanbul, Turkey. From inside these walls, they ruled the powerful Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years. But the golden age of the Ottomans came under a sultan whose celebrated reign lasted an incredible 46 years. His name, Suleyman the Magnificent. Like Alexander the Great, Suleyman inherited his wealth and power from his father. In 1520, his empire included parts of Europe, Asia Minor, Syria, Upper Mesopotamia, Arabia, and Egypt. His powerful government was based on efficient administration, run less like a military stronghold and more like an organized bureaucracy.
He was the very first Ottoman ruler to make sure that power devolved not around the person of the Sultan, but had become somewhat impersonal through codes, through ritual, through ceremonial, through organized forms of behavior that did not depend on a singular person.
And in a way, that's beginning to show us what the future is going to be countries that are based around bureaucracies, around great civil administration. In that regard, Suleyman the Magnificent is a very modern person.
He controlled his empire from the huge Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, a sprawling compound of endless rooms, mosques, and minarets, a hospital, and a school. A staff of almost 20,000 worked within the confines of its walls. Nearly 5,000 lived there on a daily basis.
The Topkapi Palace was probably the most magnificent building ever built, with the greatest amount of wealth ever housed in any one building in the world.
Walls of gold, silver, and thousands of ornate tiles sheltered the dazzling riches of the empire. Suleyman skillfully used all of it to project an image of his power and magnificence to all who visited.
The way it projects power and magnificence is not through grand architecture, but the costumes, the jewels, the very expensive tile works, all of those would constitute the most important material objects with which he would live lavishly and project magnificence to others.
The splendor of Suleyman's influence spilled over the palace walls and onto the battlefield. During the first 2 years of his reign, he led 2 great conquests that struck at the heart of Europe. In 1521, Suleyman invaded Hungary. He marched into Belgrade and secured the lands along the Danube River. A year later, he attacked the great fortress at Rhodes and took control of the Aegean Sea. His navy was the dominant force on the Mediterranean. It raided coastal towns in Italy and Spain and dealt a crushing blow to the European fleets. Suleyman's victories nearly doubled the size of his empire and shaped his image as the protector and ruler of Islam. He was called Suleyman the Lawgiver for his role in refining ancient codes of Islamic law, and revered as Suleyman the Magnificent for his influence over European politics and his generous patronage of the arts. Suleyman brought the Ottoman Empire to its creative peak. He sponsored art, culture, and architecture, and used his great wealth to bring the best artists and poets to Istanbul. "I know of no state which is happier than this one," wrote a Venetian ambassador. "It is furnished with all God's gifts. It controls war and peace. that is rich in gold, in people, in ships, and in obedience. Obedience was expected, and Suleyman controlled his country with whatever force was needed.
Suleyman the Magnificent, like other sultans, kept a group of deaf mutes who were trained to kill. And Suleyman used them repeatedly against his own officers and even against his own sons. In one case, he watched himself while the deaf mute strangled his own son. He was a harsh man. He lived in a very harsh world, but he was able to rule this empire very effectively.
Suleyman the Magnificent, Sultan of the world, died of an illness in 1566. He was 72 years old. The golden age of the Ottoman Empire ended when Suleyman died. The government became weaker, territories were lost, and suddenly global power shifted to the great nation-states of Europe.